Our next session, we're going to talk about the other part of the three-part circle, the other foundational part that John went over this morning, which is the financial. And joining us to do that today are Jason, Laurie, and Mike Murray from Altair. And this is actually a presentation that people have requested in the past to sort of help them think about, how do I transition from having an income from one source to then living off an income in another source. So it's an interesting way to think about it. Again, as Judy sort of said for her work, a lot of it is more psychological than it is super technical. But I'm going to let them address that, and I'd like to welcome Mike Murray to the stage.
Thank you, Anna, and thanks for everyone spending the day with us. As Anna said, this will be more focused on the financial side of the wellness, the well-being, as John had put it earlier. When Jason and I first talked about this presentation, we thought the best way to present the concept would be to think about what are the three most common questions we get as clients near retirement and go into retirement. By a show of hands, who in the room has either retired in the last couple of years or plans to in the next couple of years? So a fair amount, so hopefully you'll find this good. And for those of you that work with Altair currently, this is something, as you all know, we help you with through that whole process, and I encourage you to reach out to the advisors you work with to help in this process. One thing that's different about the discussion this morning is, from a financial standpoint, we define retirement differently than as John described it this morning. Really, retirement from a financial perspective is that transition in life where your whole life you've been told save, 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 but at some point in time you go from adding money to your portfolio to actually looking to your portfolio as a source of income. And that's really, from a financial perspective, what retirement is. For some of you, it may be many years past your long-term employment because of board income, consulting income, a variety of things, but that's, from a financial perspective, is what we define as retirement is when are you going to start needing paychecks, as we call it, from your portfolio. So as we thought about the questions that people ask as they near and enter into retirement, the top three we always get are, can I retire? Should my asset allocation change in retirement? And how do I actually live off my portfolio? This concept of I've always got a paycheck, but now I have this capital, this portfolio. How do I actually live off it? What is mechanically, how does that actually work? So let's talk about the can I retire, which is usually a discussion which ideally occurs before retirement. Am I prepared to actually make that transition into retirement? And it isn't, most people think instinctively it's about the size of my portfolio. If I have X dollars, of course I can retire, I have enough money. But in reality, it's about choices that you and your spouse or significant other decide on. And those things are lifestyle, philanthropy, bequests, and there's other things that factor into it as well. So let's talk a little bit about lifestyle decisions and how that really determines whether or not you are prepared to retire. So one thing, and John mentioned earlier, is geographic. So there's two homes, a beautiful home in Winnetka and a smaller ranch home in Palo Alto, California. So one of the decisions you make in retirement, of course, is what type of a home do you want to live in? And where do you want to live? I'm from a small town in Wisconsin, and I can guarantee, much like Manhattan, Kansas, you don't need a lot of money to retire to Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. But if you want to have a beautiful home in Winnetka, does anyone have an idea, guess what that home costs? How much? No. So that home, according to Zillow right now in Winnetka, is worth about $2.5 million, okay? Palo Alto, California, a small ranch, which if you're buying the home on the left, you might think of the one on the right as potentially a teardown. Guess how much the home in Palo Alto costs? $2.5 million. In fact, I was in Palo Alto earlier this year, and I pulled up the Zillow app. I was going for a walk in the morning before my meeting started, and I saw a house that was for sale, and to me it looked like a teardown, $3.4 million. So clearly, where you want to live and the type of home you want to live in has a big impact on whether your portfolio is prepared for you to retire. Lifestyle also, you want to have a nice car. So there's, of course, within the BMW family, there's a 3 Series and a 7 Series. Both great cars, both BMWs, but decisions, and you don't think about it, you might think of it as, do I buy a Bugatti or a Honda Accord? But even within owning a BMW, it can be a big price difference, and that's a lifestyle choice. So does anyone know what the base price differences are between these two cars? 40,000. So the starting base price for 7 Series is 81, and for 3 Series is 33,000. So both BMWs, both very nice cars, but it's a lifestyle decision. Do you want to drive the flagship car from that automaker, or do you want to buy more of the entry level? So these decisions, it's not just about the giant decisions. Small decisions add up over time. Philanthropy. There's a variety of ways. You can give, small checks to the local charity. You can desire to have an entire building named after you, or you can want to have a brick at the local community park. And these are all decisions that, once again, it comes down to not the size of the portfolio, but how big of an impact in philanthropy do you want to make? Do you want your name on a building, or do you just simply want a brick, or do you just want anonymously make donations? All these things feed into the goals that you set as you look into retirement. Bequest. 2 different choices here. We have the royal family on the left, which is designed for keeping wealth in the family, future generations wealthier and wealthier. And then you've got the Bill Gates, who obviously is a very wealthy individual, but has made a decision that for his inheritance to his family, it's going to be very nominal relative to his wealth. He's going to give away 99+% of his wealth to his foundation, and the kids are going to get a set dollar amount. Warren Buffett has the same philosophy, and now there's a club of billionaires that are going down the same path. So some people want to make sure they leave as much to their children and future generations as possible. Others will be happy spending the last dollar the day before they die. It's not right or wrong, it's just a personal choice. And that's what really feeds your goals to determine, are you financially prepared to enter the next phase of your life, the retirement phase, where you're starting to withdraw from your portfolio. So once you've set your goals, and more often than not, quite frankly, we'll sit down with a client, and the couple, they might have 2 competing opinions on these topics. One wants to leave as much as possible for the kids. The other doesn't care, said we've done enough for the kids already. I just want to live the lifestyle that I want to live forever. It's not right or wrong, but coming together in a common place is important, and that's often what you work through with your advisor. It's not a list you pull out of your pocket and recite. It's a discussion. It's a dialogue. It's a process to understand what goals and objectives, what financial goals and objectives do you want to accomplish. The other input, so once you've identified your goals, you want to model these goals. You really stress test and figure out, okay, now that I know what I want to do, the life that I want to live and what I want to leave, if anything, do I have enough money to accomplish that? So there's a lot of inputs. There's portfolio returns. You have to make assumptions about what a return's going to be in the future. What's the size of my portfolio, and time horizon. Someone, I think one of the speakers earlier had made a comment about time horizon. Is it 10 years, or is it 5 years, or is it 40 years? And that those are all inputs into your, what we call capital sufficiency analysis. And capital sufficiency is all about, given all these factors, some I can control, some I can't, do I have a large enough portfolio and a large enough capital to meet my financial goals and objectives long term? So we talked about goals a little bit, and how even small, what may appear to be small choices, can make a big impact on the output of that analysis. The next piece of it is portfolio returns. We all want to have great returns, but the reality is returns aren't always great, and you have to account for periods of underperformance. If you look back over roughly a 90-year period from 1926 through March of 2016, the S&P 500 looks nice and smooth, averaging just over 9% a year. It looks relatively stable, and that's the problem when you look at a data set over 90 years. Things look relatively stable. However, within that 90-year period, there are periods of significant outperformance and underperformance. So for those of you that may have retired in the early 90s, well done. What a great time to retire, because the following 10 years was just a phenomenal period in the market. You had a tremendous tailwind to your retirement, because the equity markets in the U.S. were averaging almost 16% a year for that first 10 years of retirement. So things likely in your model, in your capital sufficiency, were ahead of schedule. You probably had more money at the end of that than you thought you would, because the returns were so great. In fact, if you started with $1 million, by the end of that decade, that million would have turned into $4.5 million. So a phenomenal time period to be invested, a phenomenal time period to have retired if you had retired in the early 90s. Then, for those of you unfortunate enough to have retired in 1999 or 2000, we get the next 10-year period. For an entire 10-year period, the S&P 500 returned almost negative 6% per year. So clearly, very different experience your first 10 years of retirement compared to retiring in 1990. Going back to this capital sufficiency, the modeling, figuring out, is my portfolio sufficient to to retire, you don't want to pick the best period, because that would not be logical. Of course, you're going to make it in every case. You also can't necessarily budget to have the worst case repeat itself, because you're going to really reduce your lifestyle to enable yourself to retire. So what you need to do is you need to figure out some return that's reasonable, not in the highest, not the lowest, but something that's reasonable. And what we always encourage clients to do is stress test it. You know, if you start off, say you pick a 5 or 6% annual return, something in between those two, then stress test it. So what if we did enter a period of negative returns for the next 10 years? How would that impact my ability to accomplish my financial goals and objectives? And that process can be a very long process, and it's a really important, critical process to give you the comfort level to enter into that retirement phase of life. So the output of doing this capital sufficiency, the modeling, is typically falls into 3 categories. One, the output is you have a portfolio to build a legacy, which simply means that during your retirement years, you're actually continuing to accumulate wealth. Your spending relative to the portfolio size is well within means, and you're spending less than you're growing the portfolio. So that's an example of building a legacy, creating an ability to give money away at the end of life. Option 2, or output 2, is a portfolio to retire. A lot of people fall into this category. You have enough capital to clearly make it through your retirement, but that capital depletes over time. There's not a concern you're going to run out of money, but you're not growing a legacy, you're not growing your wealth over that time. Once again, there's no right or wrong answer. In both of these cases, we would say that's a passing case depending on your goals. And then there's the output 3, which is a difficult one, because clearly from all the modeling, you don't have enough capital to make it through retirement to achieve all your goals and objectives. And that's a tough discussion, because you have to do one of 2 things. One is, if you're set on the goals and objectives, and those are important to you and you prioritize the highest, the logical response is, can you continue to work for 3, 4, 5 years, or as long as it needs, to build enough capital to get to a position to be able to retire? 2 is, it's an opportunity to take a look at your goals and objectives and say, well, I'm really set on retiring in the next 2 years, so therefore I'm going to have to take a look at my goals and objectives. Let's make some changes there. Maybe I choose the 3 series over the 7 series. Maybe I don't want to have that second home in Palo Alto, California. But those are the discussions that you have to go through. And this is all about the preparation to retirement. Once you've got your head around where you stand financially, now you're put in a place where it's like, now you understand, okay, am I ready to make that next leap to retirement? So once you've decided where you stand from a capital sufficiency perspective, the next question we always get is, well, should my asset allocation change in retirement? The common belief is, as I approach and enter retirement, my investments should become less risky and more income focused, because people have this mindset that I just can live off the income from my portfolio, but I should never touch the principal of the portfolio. And that's what should drive the risk in the portfolio. Our view is a little different. Our view is, risk is a function of 2 things. 1, the probability of success in achieving your goals, which is the capital sufficiency we just talked about. 2, what's your tolerance for portfolio loss? Sometimes those things align and sometimes they don't. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But if you're in a position where, actually we're going to go to the next slide. So thinking about the probability of achieving goals, if the output from your capital sufficiency tells you that your objectives relative to your portfolio size are very reasonable, you have a high probability of achieving those goals. So therefore, you don't have to take a lot of risk if you don't want to. If you have more than enough capital to meet those financial goals and objectives, you have a choice now. You don't have to take a lot of risk. You don't need to take much risk to do that. If your outcome is a medium result, meaning that it's likely to pass, but you got to take a little bit of risk in hopes of a slightly higher return to meet those goals. That's what we define as medium. And then the last choice is low. If there's a low probability, if the unfortunate result of your capital sufficiency is something's got to change, the goals have to change, lifestyle goals, or you work longer, if you're unwilling to do that, the only possibility of reaching those goals is to take a lot more risk. So your risk tolerance would have to be, the risk needed to be high. You have to take more risk in hopes of getting a higher return to meet those goals and objectives. And once again, I want to remind you, this isn't about portfolio size. I mean, I've seen people with tens of $1 million portfolios that don't work. They just spend too much for a variety of reasons. And I've seen people with a lot smaller portfolios where it works fabulously well because their lifestyle is well within means. So it isn't a function about the degree of wealth. In fact, John touched on a point earlier about just the relative perspective of your wealth. So if you lived in Palo Alto, California, and you had $10 million, you might actually not feel well off at all. Compare that to living in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, you have $10 million, you're very wealthy. So sometimes people get caught up in this idea of their neighbors and the people that they hang out with in the community. But it's really a personal decision. It's about you. You try to avoid this idea of keeping up with the Joneses and comparing yourself to your neighbor. It's all about your happiness and what you want to accomplish. So that's looking at it from the probability of actually achieving your goals. So let's take a look about how you feel. So we think of it in the terms of how do you feel when the market goes down. So some people, no one feels good, by the way. Some people feel very bad, some people feel bad, and some people feel okay. And it's all perspective. If you're one who feels very bad, you can't sleep at night, it's impacting your marriage, your lifestyle, that's a clear indication you have a low risk tolerance. Any losses in the portfolio, if you feel that badly about them, you really do not have a very high risk tolerance. If you feel bad, it's probably a medium risk tolerance. And if you feel okay, and the perspective is, markets come and go as we saw in those 2 decades, and I feel okay about it because I know things will return over time, that demonstrates that you probably have a higher risk tolerance. So we've talked about the probability of success. We've talked about how you feel about losses in the portfolio. And reminder, the more risk you take, the higher the probability of having short-term losses. Now let's put the two concepts together. In an ideal world, if you have little need to take on risk and you have a low risk tolerance, everything's great. You don't need to take it, you don't have the tolerance to take it, so everything's great. Same with medium and high. So everything works out perfectly well. There's also scenarios where what we call you have a lot of options. You don't need to take a lot of risk because your capital is sufficient, but you have a high risk tolerance. What that means to us is you have a lot of options. You don't have to take a lot of risk, but you have the ability to take risk if you want to. And that's where we have a further discussion. That's where a lot of the estate planning stuff comes into play about, do you want to take more risk in hopes of creating more wealth long term? Or do you just want to have to not worry about it and take no risk or very little risk to accomplish your goals? It's a very good position to be in because it creates a lot of flexibility. And then there are those that fall into the last category, which is you don't have the cap sufficient portfolio size to meet all your goals and objectives, yet at the same time you have a very low risk tolerance. You can't sleep at night when there are portfolio losses. And this situation is obviously highlighted in red, is not an ideal situation. That's something where you have to take a risk level that you're uncomfortable with. So that's when you really have to go back and take a hard look at what your goals are and what your anticipation of future work is going to be. Because that's a situation which makes a very undesirable result for a variety of reasons. So we talked a little bit about, can I retire? Am I financially prepared to retire? Is my risk tolerance consistent with what I need out of my portfolio to retire financially? And now Jason's going to talk about how do I actually live off my portfolio in retirement. And then following Jason's comments, we're going to have a Q&A for any of you that have questions.
Thanks, Mike. As Mike said, I'm going to turn my attention to the question of how do I live off my portfolio mechanically, thinking about the portfolio in context of it meeting your cash needs in retirement. And I'm going to follow the same format Mike did, talking about questions or common beliefs we often hear from clients or prospects. The first is, in retirement, I will be living off the portfolio, so I need income-generating investments to replicate my paycheck. A very common, intuitive thought. I need income-focused investments because that's, in fact, how I'm going to replace my paycheck when I was working. But actually, our view of it is that you need to view the portfolio in the context of a total return, income plus price appreciation. The cash needs can come from both perspectives. And really the reason why we focus in on it, and it's the punchline of my section before we end for lunch, is that when we focus on total return, we can build better, more fully diversified portfolios than when we're just anchored on income generation. And I'll give you a few examples of that in just a minute. Or the way I also like to think about it is when you're only focused on income generating, it tends to be a reactionary portfolio, a backward-looking portfolio based on today's yield environment, versus putting together a portfolio about expected return, future return, maximizing return, minimizing risk. And again, I'll give specific examples in a minute, but that's really the punchline. So backing up for just a second and talking about the components of the return. First is the income portion. Most are probably familiar. We have both interest and dividends coming into a portfolio, whether they're from bonds, stocks, or mutual funds. They are regular cash payments, whether they're quarterly, annually, or even monthly. But when we talk about the total return concept, we're not only talking about the interest and dividends, but we're also talking about the price appreciation and the capital gains. And so we're looking at the total return of the portfolio. And we believe that the total return of the portfolio is how you should fund your lifestyle in retirement or fund those cash needs. And for all the clients in the room, you know when you have your quarterly performance reports, Altair breaks these out for you. But really, that bottom line number on that summary page of your quarterly performance report is, in fact, the total return, because that's what we feel is, in fact, the most important. A different take or twist on the same concept, and again, hammering the concept of total return versus income and price appreciation. If I spend more than my portfolio generates in income, I will be invading or dipping into principal and destroying the portfolio. A very common belief. I should really only be spending the income. Well, again, when you look at it from a total return perspective, you're actually agnostic as to whether the portfolio withdrawals are coming from interest, dividends, or capital appreciation. Now, there's a big caveat here that maybe some of you are immediately thinking. It has to be done in a tax-efficient manner, because you wouldn't be agnostic depending on if it is tax inefficient. But if it's done in a tax-efficient manner, you're actually agnostic. And our simple math exercise, and that's all it is a math exercise, is saying if you have two portfolios, they each start with $10 million, the withdrawal requirements or the cash flow needed to fund the lifestyle is a 4% withdrawal rate, so roughly $400,000. And it's a course of 20 years. And so the total return that we're assuming is 9% for both portfolios. Portfolio one is pretty much equal between income or agnostic between income and capital gains. Portfolio two is far more heavily skewed towards capital gains versus income. This is a math exercise. As you would probably guess, if you're earning 9%, withdrawing 4%, the ending portfolio value is the same. You're agnostic as to how you get to the return or take out the withdrawals, assuming it's being done in a tax-efficient manner. And as an example, what I mean by tax-efficient manner is taking long-term capital gains versus all short-term capital gains. On the income side, using both municipal bonds, which are tax-free at the federal level, and then mixing in some taxable bonds. The problem, though, is although the math equation, we're agnostic between income and capital appreciation, the world we live in today is certainly not agnostic. It is screaming how we potentially can get the return from our portfolio. And so this chart is a 20-year chart of 10-year Treasury bonds, the yield of 10-year Treasury bonds. And so most of you in the room know that today we are at historically low interest rates. I don't think that's new news to most people that have been here. But really the dramatic nature of it, I think really hits home when you talk about generating income or taking withdrawals from portfolios in retirement. 20 years ago, a 10-year Treasury was earning about 7%. Today, it's a fourth that, down to about 1.8% as of last night. So it's easy to see it in just graphically how generating income simply by yield is a very difficult exercise right now, and it creates a reactionary portfolio. And if you actually put some numbers to it, it's really very startling. You have, again, we're investing in 10-year treasuries, and say the goal is I want to generate $100,000 of income using 10-year treasuries. How much do I have to actually invest in 10-year treasuries to get my $100,000? In 1996, I only needed about $1.6 million. Today, to get that same $100,000, I need $5.6 million just to get $100,000 worth of income. Dramatically different capital needed to generate the same level of income. And actually, it's really even worse than that, because that's what the next slide is doing. John mentioned purchasing power and the idea that through retirement, we have to keep up with inflation. And so $100,000 in 1996 doesn't buy the same goods and services it does today. We've got to inflate this number. So to be fair, if I'm generating $100,000 in 1996, I have to generate $151 today to keep my lifestyle constant. Now I need $8.5 million just to generate that same $151,000. Dramatic difference in what it takes to generate that kind of income. Now, we're using treasuries here, but I could substitute municipal bonds, I could substitute corporate bonds. The same takeaway would be appropriate, is that from over the last 20 years, the income available is dramatically different. So what have we seen? What have we witnessed over the last 5 years as rates have plummeted? The income that we're getting off of our fixed income investments, whether they're treasuries, whether they're taxables, whether they're municipal bonds. Well, most investors haven't really just stood by and said, well, I'm really ready to take a dramatic hit to my lifestyle. That's not what we've seen. What we've seen is investors, unfortunately, reach for yield. And they say, I need to go find securities that generate more income. That is what I have to do here. But the problem with that, getting to the punchline, is what happens is they take on a tremendous amount of risk in doing that. And potentially it's unknown to them the amount of risk they're taking. So in my quick example here, I'm using 3 securities or 3 assets. One, the purple line is regular old taxable bonds. So this is an index, Vanguard's taxable bond market. Governments, corporates. It's a total index, very conservative. It yielded about 5 years ago 2.5%, not very different today. The next asset is a little more esoteric. Some of you may have heard of it. Master Limited Partnerships, MLPs. These are actually created out of the tax code. And what these vehicles do is that they're in the business of handling and transporting hydrocarbons, mostly through oil and gas pipelines. And they charge a fee for that service. And that fee is a direct pass-through to their investors. They're actually publicly traded partnerships. Well, what you can see by my chart is they actually have a tremendously high yield. And that's what attracts people to them, especially in the current yield environment that we're in. And then finally, we have junk bonds. That's the green line. So these are taxable corporate bonds that are issued by companies that are more risky, less stable. So in order to attract investors, they have to pay a higher rate of return. Very standard. Junk bonds have been around since really the 80s. And again, yielding about 6.5%, much higher than the standard fixed income market, and it's yielding about that today. So this is a 5-year period, and the only reason why I stopped it here at August 1st, 2014, as you could probably have already guessed, especially for those of you who have the handouts, is this was the peak of the reaching for yield in these asset classes. And as you can probably guess, is when I turn the slide, you know what's going to happen. There you go. Is the last year and a half of this 5-year cycle is that the MLPs and junk bonds have dramatically collapsed. MLPs from the peak to the trough are 50+% down. So the concept here is that reaching for yield brings on additional risk. And that's not a bad thing. The takeaway of the discussion isn't, well, you don't want to be taking on risk. Unfortunately, all of us in the room, including myself, if we want any kind of an after-tax return, we are in an environment you have no choice. You have to take risk. Because the yield that is available to us in the non-risky or zero-risk investments is basically just barely keeping up with inflation. But the concept is, first of all, be cognizant that you're taking on more risk, and then more importantly is take that risk so that it yields the highest expected return for the given level of risk. Buying yields or buying MLPs up here just did not fit that bill, and also junk bonds. And I encourage any of you, because if it's a good exercise, you can Google MLPs. And what will come up in that exercise is a ton of research reports, and I'll leave all the names out of it to protect the innocent, about right here in the 2014, 2013 time period that these were the best investments in sliced bread. I mean, read them top to bottom, and they're all there on the first page of Google. But again, it's not that you didn't want to take any risks, it's just you had to be cognizant of the risk you were taking. So we want to replace our paycheck from our employer, from our portfolio. Now, the frequency of that paycheck is really up to you. We have clients that take monthly withdrawals from their portfolio, quarterly, some even annually. So how does the concept work? Well, the way we like to think about it, and for some of you in the room we're already doing this for, is we have all these sources of income. And really from the portfolio, we've got the dividends, the interest, and the capital gains. But then you've got your, whether it's consulting income, board income, pensions, Social Security, IRA distributions if you're over the age of 70 and a half. And we like to create a liquidity reserve. These tend to be less stable, but this liquidity reserve is the stability. And so here's where we can turn around and give you your paycheck. So we can have clients who say, I want $25,000 a month or whatever the number is. And so we're creating the stability down here by managing the liquidity reserve. And so thinking about it in terms of a paycheck, but not thinking about it in terms of over-managing or micromanaging any one of the buckets up there. Bringing it really back to Mike's presentation, in the end, it is about the portfolio size in relation to the cash flow needs. It's that relationship, not any one in absolute terms. And of course, we have Benjamin Franklin here, very negative against debt. And then Oscar Wilde, we had to throw this one in here. Anyone who lives within their means suffers from a lack of imagination. So in conclusion, before we take some questions, Mike and I, and break for lunch, kind of summing up the key points. First is identify goals and financial objectives. This really is the key. And I think when people hear this, they think it's kind of trite. But when we're in these discussions, what we realize is people really do have individualized goals. And I can think of a whole host of my clients. I mean, I have a client, what's really important to him and his wife is that he has a dollar amount in mind that when the last of them to die goes to his high school, his Catholic high school. That's very important to him. He will change his lifestyle to back in or reverse engineer into that number. That's very important to him. Once we have the goals and objectives, it's also determine the sufficiency of assets. And as Mike said, and I think this is the key, it's not just to plug in a 6% rate of return and say, oh, gee, does it work? It's to stress test it. What happens if you go through a bad period? What happens if you go through good periods? And that's really important. Again, you have clients who react very differently to those stress tests. We had a client recently. I ran through this exercise, and I say I'm taking more credit. Someone else prepared the work. But the 6% analysis worked fine. He said, oh, great, I can retire. But then we did the stress test, and it turned out over the bad period, it didn't work that well. Some people's conclusion would be, well, I'm willing to reduce my lifestyle if that period occurs to make it work. But his response was, I've worked too, and then he had a few adjectives, hard, to reduce my lifestyle at this point. I'm going to work another few years. That was his conclusion. It's not right, it's not wrong, it's how he viewed the world. And as John, really all the panelists said today, this is a very unique reaction, a very unique input as to how you view all these objectives and goals. Mike talked about gauging risk tolerance, and then we, of course, want to develop the strategy around that. What is the appropriate portfolio? What is the mix of assets that is a forward-looking portfolio, not a backward-looking portfolio? And that's, of course, how we view the world, not just on income, but on total return. So with that, we have roughly 5 minutes before we break for lunch, and we'll open it up to any questions on our presentation. Sure, which one? Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. The question was, how much time do we spend on each of the categories? Yeah, I think that's a good question. It depends on where the client or prospect is in the life cycle. But typically, newer clients, we spend a lot of time on bullet point 1 and 2. And that tends to be most of the time. In fact, it's very often the case, new clients, we won't talk about investing to the second, third, even later than that meeting. Just to That's right. That's right. I think that's right. Is it? Yeah. Well, actually, I'll let Mike answer that because I know you have a story or two.
So the question was, how do you get people to agree, spouses to agree? And the answer is sometimes they don't. I mean, sometimes it really is. It can take, as Jason said, 2, 3, 4 meetings. The reality is, if you're going to manage it as a single portfolio, there has to be some common ground. There has to be a give and take. And more often than you might think, the spouses have clearly not discussed this prior to that first meeting. And you get there and you realize that one wants to spend everything and one wants to give everything to the kids. And the answer is probably something in between. So we help people through the process of trying to figure that out, to get to a place where you're both in agreement. I think the other thing to add to Jason's comments are, we'll do a capital sufficiency on the front end when a client becomes a client for the first time. But the other logical points that you do an update to the capital sufficiency are life events, retirement, a change in profession, which has a different financial income associated with it, some sort of a health issue in the family. It may be the client themselves. It might be a grandchild that has a special needs that was unexpected, where they want to provide some financial support. So once we do a capital sufficiency, it isn't one and done. In fact, in some cases, Matt and I just did one for a new client. We probably ran 12 plus cases of the capital sufficiency on the front end, because they had a lot of things they were trying to decide that were very different paths they could potentially go down. They wanted some financial guidance about which ones were logical, which ones weren't. But it's the life events where you often will go back. And the other event is bad performance. A client that retired in 2000 and 2009, guess what they wanted to do? Take a look at capital sufficiency. They didn't have the assets they thought they were going to have in 2009 when they retired in 2000, because the markets didn't provide during that time frame. One more comment, sorry, is risk tolerance also can change over time. People, if you live through an 809 period versus living through the 90s, the perception of risk tolerance does change, or life events also, death of a sibling or something like that, makes people sort of rethink things in their lives. But all those times we're more than happy to encourage people to rethink the capital sufficiency, which may or may not lead to a change in the allocation and risk of the portfolio, but it's certainly an important discussion to have.
I just add one other comment about bringing the spouse in. I had a brand new prospect, and he specifically said, I want you to meet with my spouse alone, because I believe she's going to give you the answers that I want to hear and not the answers she wants to say. So I do think it's important to, however it is you decide to go about it, to extract that information. Any other questions? All right, well, thanks. We'll, on break here for lunch, they'll bring out the food, and then we'll start up again at 1.